History is told from the eyes of the victor. But what happens if there is no winner? In the case of the War of 1812, it has been said that Canadians know they won the war, the Americans think they won, and the British don't even know there was a war. During the war, the influence on the countries can be foreseen through its coverage in the newspaper. Newspapers during the War of 1812 were more opinion pieces that showed the personalities of the publishers than fact-based reports of events occurring in the war. So looking back on the newspaper industry in Canada and the United States revealed the attitudes during the war and the influence this type of reporting had on the two nations. The United States of America declared war on Great Britain over the impressment of soldiers and issues of trade in 1812, marking the start of the War of 1812, a war that would not gain land or rights, but would set a standard for the press in the United States of America. During the war, Madison was urged by his Republican officials to revive the Sedition Act because of the responses to the war being printed in the Federalist newspapers of the time. The Sedition Act prohibited any negative public attacks on the government of the United States of America. This became an issue during the war because of events such as the burning of Washington, which was used in the newspapers as Federalist fuel in opposing the war. Despite being counseled to reenact the Sedition Act, Madison refused to recognize governmental power over expression, and he did not want to restrict the press through the military. This decision allowed his opposition to use the press freely and attack him and criticize the war, fueling the fire of opposition. The Madison administration was attacked on the basis that it was their war and not the country's. The newspapers wrote as if the nation took no part in the war, but the presidency was alone in the situation pertaining to it. For instance, the Boston Gazette published, "The war is truly and justly called Madison's War, and you are responsible for the consequences, which placed the entire war on the shoulders of President Madison." Madison was directly attacked for the War of 1812 through the newspapers and blamed for the situation of the war over any other aspect of the American government. It was not important that it takes more than the president to declare war. It mattered that Madison declared it, and the Federalist newspapers went as far as demanding his resignation for it. The Boston Gazette argued that Madison was no longer trusted by either party in Congress and that he could only rely on the Almighty to work a miracle, which meant that Madison was no longer able to respond to the needs of the United States. The newspaper continued to tell the public that the only course of action that was left for Madison was for him to resign and no more expose the world to his miserable politics for the country's ruin. Unlike the United States of America and Great Britain, Canada can be argued to have won the War of 1812 despite the fact that the treaty ending the war simply set everything back to how it was before it. At the time of the war, Canada did not have an independent national identity, but was a British colony ruled under the British monarch, which was an ocean away. Canada's national identity evolution can be established through the newspapers of the War of 1812. Throughout the war, Canadian newspapers focused on two aspects of the American people, their character and their behavior. Attacking the enemy in print was a tactic used to rally the citizens of the territory against the newly formed nation that had every intention of invading their land and obtaining it. The newspapers painted the Americans as presumptuous, foolish, and vain people. Americans were considered as such because the declared war against the greatest world power of the time, which was seen as unbelievable because it was not seen as plausible that Americans had a chance at defeating the power with such a magnitude of resources behind it as Great Britain. When the Americans attempted to invade the Canadian territory, the newspapers described them as having nothing but ignorant conceit, because they invaded with a force that did not exceed 10,000 soldiers. Americans were considered to have a blatant disrespect for human life on the part of the enemy soldiers, and were referred to as American white savages by the Canadian newspapers. Battles that resulted in the death of British or Canadian soldiers were often described from the perspective of the wrongs of war committed by the Americans. Depicting American actions in such a negative way allowed editors to report on similar actions by Canadians in a positive light. For instance, the burning of Washington was seen as a result of the behavior exhibited by the Americans, and therefore completely acceptable in the eyes of the Canadians who had admonished them for similar acts. The descriptions of Americans in such a negative light gave Canadians something that had before been absent from their culture, and their identity. Once it was established that Americans' behavior and character were wrong, it became clear what Canadians were not supposed to be. Therefore, it created what Canadians were supposed to be, the opposite of what Americans were. The idea of Canadian identity is further evident through the newspaper's portrayal of Great Britain further into the war. Not only did Canadians start to establish how they were different from Americans, but they also determined how they differed from the British. This is noticeable from the fact that Canadian newspapers began to openly criticize Britain towards the end of the war. Once the differences were established, Canadian newspapers began reflecting on what the Canadian identity should be, which often included support of the British Crown. However, there were a few aspects of the Canadian identity that was specific to Canadians. For instance, a gallant behavior, a belief in unity and adversity, were notable among the characteristics seen as specific to Canadians. The Canadian gallantry was seen as the opposite of American behavior during the war and compared to the British heritage. In Canadian battles, whether it ended in defeat or victory, gallantry was used to explain their actions. The unity in adversity was determined by the Canadians' willingness to fight to defend their country. When one part of Canada was under attack, different areas of Canada were there to lend support, which was referred to by the newspapers as Canadians from all around having uniformly viewed our cause as theirs. They have applauded our efforts, rejoiced in our successes, and pitied our misfortunes. The reporting of Canadian identity was crucial in developing it, so the War of 1812 was essential in creating the Canadian identity that was featured in the newspapers of the time. Newspaper coverage during the War of 1812 was important to the attitudes towards the war and the countries involved in it. The United States of America had a mixture of support and criticism, but the criticism is what emphasized the freedoms of Americans during the time. President Madison did not use his power to quiet the criticism, which made a statement on the power of the government. Future presidents would argue over this power, and some would take the opposite approach. But how Madison handled the War of 1812 press coverage from Federalist newspapers highlighted the influence the press has and the freedoms it should be allowed. Where the United States established a right to criticize its own government, Canada gained an identity that was all its own. Newspapers in Canada determined how other countries in the war behaved and saw how they did not want to be, resulting in the emergence of a Canadian identity. Both the United States of America and Canada were influenced by the newspaper coverage of the War of 1812 because of the influence it had on the public opinion and reaction to the war in the country itself. This presentation includes information from the sources of ushistory.org, the Association for Canadian Studies, the Washington Post, the Journal of Historical Pragmatics, and the novel War and Press Freedom by Jeffrey Smith.